Well, good morning, everybody. Most of the time when we start talking about earthquakes, we always come at it as the practitioners. There's no mystery what needs to be done. We know that as the USGS continues to build upon our knowledge of the risk and our understanding of what those risks are, I'm very proud of the guys that are here from FEMA that work in the building codes and looking at standards and engineering to look at what the research community is telling us about that risk and how to build in it. We pretty well know, based upon our knowledge of today, how to build resilience into structures in earthquake country. But that's not static, it's always changing. As we saw when we went down to Christchurch, a lot of our assumptions that we had been building, we saw similar types of construction and codes that we were advocating for not always perform the way we thought it was going to do. So we know this is a learning process. We know it isn't static. But things aren't changing. We're pretty much, from where we're at 4 years ago, what has substantially changed as far as outcomes go? We know more. We got better data. We're talking about a lot of things. But what's really changed? Not much. Why? Because our most effective tool is getting local communities to adopt and enforce building codes appropriate for the hazards where they live. And we often hear this when people are trying to talk about changing and updating building codes, that there are a lot of people that will come out and say, you're making homes unaffordable. This is costing too much. You're pricing people out of their homes. And in many parts of the country where we do have earthquake risk, we don't have any seismic standards. We don't even in some cases have building codes. And the argument has always been that, well, this is more bureaucracy, more regulation, it's bad, we need to build homes, we need to grow our tax base, we need to grow the economy. And we've been fighting, in many cases, losing battles. Because we're talking about science and we're talking about things that fortunately don't happen very often, and quite honestly, builders are more focused on it doesn't fall down until after the sale. I mean, think about it. The tendency is we build for the day-to-day environment. I mean, if you looked at this building right now as designed with no earthquake functions, it's performing its job. It's resisting gravity, right? From the engineering standpoint, if this is what I was building it for, if I was only dealing with gravity as my principal threat, I've achieved success. But now what happens when I start getting lateral movements and up and down movements? How would the building perform? Now, I'm from hurricane country. We learned a long time ago that you have to build for the environment you're in, and that too oftentimes the political decision-making process would take the science and go, that's inconvenient for us. We had a senator in the West Florida panhandle, or what we like to call LA, not Los Angeles, lower Alabama, that believed that the wind standards that the engineers had come up with shouldn't apply there because they have pine trees. And pine trees offer a natural wind resistance, and therefore if you weren't on the beach, it really wasn't necessary to build for what all the science and all the engineering told us was going to happen when you got a mile off the beach, because the trees will block the winds. We had a storm come up there in that year of 4 hurricanes, Hurricane Ivan, and Ivan was inconvenient because it blew down all the pine trees on top of the houses that they smashed. And then with no barrier, apparently roofs started flying off. Shortly thereafter that senator was championing that we needed to increase the building codes because we cannot afford to keep losing these homes this way. And that's the problem. Too often it takes the disaster to happen before action occurs. So how do we fight that? We got to change our vocabulary. When we're talking about these incremental costs, they're telling you you're making homes unaffordable. We're saying it's only going to be incremental cost. And they're saying that's going to reduce homeowner sales. Now, I have nothing against builders and developers, and I am not an anti-builder and anti-developer, and I think they ought to build to their heart's content. But I also think, from the standpoint of government, we have to quit subsidizing risk below the point at which it benefits society. And so since they like to use business terms, and we're oftentimes approaching this as government regulators and authorizers and authorities that are basically put into a pile that says your bureaucratic red tape, then use their words against them. We're not talking about affordability at the point of transaction. We're talking about the total cost of home ownership. Home ownership includes insurability. And if it isn't insurable, it's not affordable. Because here's the bitter lesson we've learned too many times. Here in California, Mark, what's your insurance rate running right now on earthquake insurance? 5, 6, 7%, somewhere in there? You're up to 10? Okay, so 10% of the structures have insurance. What's the average deductible on that insurance policy?
It ranges from 5% to 25%.
Okay, so, 25% of your home's is basically what your deductible is. So if you got a $200,000 home, that's $50,000 out of pocket before your insurance company pays. What? I'm sorry. 25% of what?
Of the rebuilding costs.
Oh.
Yeah, so if you have a rebuilding cost of $400,000.
It's 25% of that.
You self-insure. It's not a check you have to receive a payment, whether that's the amount you decide to self-insure.
Yeah, so they'll pay you $300,000 of that. So you're on the hook for the first $100,000.
Yeah, you have $300,000 to rebuild.
That's even worse. I mean, when you talk about this, most people they don't carry the routine stuff. And this is what happened to us in Napa. We didn't have a high insurance rate there. A lot of it was slab and foundational cracks. Those that did have insurance had pretty high deductibles, but most people didn't even have the earthquake insurance, so they were basically bare. There wasn't a lot of visible damage from the outside, and that's why it took so long to get a declaration, but once you started getting into it and actually looking at foundation, these were long-term problems that these homes were ultimately going to fail. Even though they may not have failed structurally in the earthquake, they were severely damaged. And so we set up these situations where we talk about home ownership and affordability, and we never talk about the total cost of ownership, because there's this assumption in public that somebody's going to come take care of me. There's going to be a bailout. If I put enough pressure on Congress, they're going to do something for me. Guess what? The maximum payout from a FEMA program for individual assistance is about $33,000. And Mark, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but what were the numbers for Napa averaging under individual assistance? They weren't big numbers. I think we were running 5,000, 6,000 was probably about 5,000 average. Trust me, the damage was far more substantial than that. But our programs weren't really designed to make people whole. They were just to deal with some emergency work, maybe just enough to keep them in their homes, but it didn't take care of the long-term issues. And so we have this situation we've set up that says, on one hand, we have good science and good data, and we're constantly learning and we're constantly updating our codes and standards to build for the risk. And we are moving beyond just life safety, because we're finding in many cases that in just building for life safety, we're still leaving a lot of exposure. And for incremental increases, we can actually make buildings more resilient, so with minimal repairs, we can get back in them. And then on the other side of the argument, when you go to say, well, we need to adopt more codes that are more stringent to build to this, well, it's not affordable. The argument has to be the total cost of ownership, and is it insurable? Let's talk about public structures. You hear about all the billions of dollars that went out in Hurricane Sandy. Do you know what all that public assistance money went for? Uninsured losses. Now, I get picking up debris and response costs or things that are appropriate, but we ended up reimbursing tremendous amounts of money, like in the billions, for wastewater treatment plants, hospitals. And you're asking, well, you're the taxpayer. You do realize that, right? You are paying for this. That the only time you pay for those costs is when local governments decide not to carry insurance or don't carry enough insurance. So you as a taxpayer are actually underwriting this risk. And I'm not sure that it's necessarily in your benefit to do that. So we're trying to drive the arguments that If it's not insurable, why? Why aren't we building things to become insurable? And with earthquake hazards, it's not going to be easy, and we understand we have a built infrastructure that we're still going to have to deal with. But why are we going forward, either rebuilding after disasters or in new construction, continuing to build to a point that is not insurable? Because what we'll hear is it's not affordable, it's not available. But remember I talked about total cost of ownership? If you don't have it insured, you just transfer the risk somewhere. And if you're a public entity and you get a disaster declaration, you transfer it to the taxpayer. So they end up underwriting the risk. And here's what I learned about risk behavior. When the point of the pain is too long, behavior will not change. It's capitalism. So remember the whole argument about bureaucratic red tape makes things too expensive? I'm a capitalist. I believe you should risk-base your decisions upon whether or not private investment will back the investments. And if they're not, then you as a taxpayer are backing those investments for somebody to make profit. Now think about that. In a capitalist society, we would go to our insurance companies. We would ask our insurance companies, would you insure our risk to protect our capital? If it makes sense, they're going to do it. It's going to cost you money. But it's a transaction based upon you want to cover your risk, you go to the private sector, they back that risk, you insure it. If something happens, they pay up. If not, they make a profit. The bottom line is they always have to make a profit because they have investors that are willing to put money into your risk. But if you're not going to build to where it's insurable, they're not going to ask their investors to put money into a loss. They'll walk away. At that point, I should be done. I can't go forward, right? Unfortunately, not in this country. Because I can usually, as I'm a government entity, use my taxing authority to cover my risk. I can bond out that construction, I can build, and now instead of having the private sector manage risk, who are pretty good gauges of what works and what doesn't work, you, the taxpayer, just underwrote that risk. Probably below the point where you needed to do the things that would have been required to make that a more resilient construction. And so when we're talking at the local level, and this is something that the team at FEMA has been working on, particularly in areas that have significant seismic risk but don't have the frequency to drive a lot of this, particularly New Madrid in the central U.S., is getting local governments to adopt building codes. And it's a checkerboard. But getting good policymakers to sit there and fight against this idea that we'll build it cheap and quick because lower cost means it's better, and go, that's not total cost of ownership. How do you build for the future and build insurability and secure your tax base? So our challenge has been we are oftentimes put into this basket of bureaucracy and red tape impeding growth. We need to change that argument around and go, no, we're not. We're trying to protect growth. We're trying to look at things that says this is good policy because it's insurable, that it's sustainable. And as Mark points out, after major earthquakes, we're going to have dark cities. Why? They're not going to be able to sustain the lack of revenue when their tax bases are destroyed. This is the other thing I think local officials forget, that and oftentimes the argument of short term, well, we're constantly building, we're growing, that's increasing our tax base. How survivable is the tax base from single point failures of hazards? And what happens, and this is not something that we don't see, we deal with it in many of these large scale disasters. What happens when your tax base doesn't make it? Hurricane Andrew happened in 1992. There was a tremendous amount of money poured into the South Florida area of impact. The problem was nobody really looked at what the economic engines driving South Florida were. And so Homestead in Florida City, there was all kinds of community works projects. We built a NASCAR track. I mean, we just dumped money down there. Yet 10 years later, they were still functionally bankrupt. Why? Their single economic engine was the Air Force Base down there, and when it closed and did not reopen it, but as a reserve base, they lost almost all of their tax base. It took them over a decade to recover. We are seeing the same thing that Mitch Landrieu is struggling with in New Orleans. Can he rebuild his community faster than the reconstruction dollars will be paid out? Because he now has about 3/4 of his population. His tax base has not come back to where it was before. And now there's a race. Can he build his communities back? And this is now 11 years after Katrina. Can he build a stable tax base to provide essential services before the rebuilding dollars run out? Now think about earthquakes. That happens like that usually is going to be much broader and the impact's much greater than we even get from the hurricane impacts. Communities generally don't have financial reserves to run for years, much less decades. And the rebuilding cost and everything else will give a short burst of economic stimulus, but will rebuild the tax base. So when we talked to local officials, we said, affordability, it isn't at the point of transaction. It's the total cost of home ownership. It's the total cost of owning that public infrastructure. It's about building resiliency and protecting your tax base. It's about ensuring that you don't have single points of failure during disasters and that you have diversified and built resiliency into your infrastructure and community so you can survive disasters. And it's about moving the risk away from subsidy below the point at which behavior changes. That's not going to be easy, and it's a bitter pill for many people to take. But that's the long-term answer. As long as we price risk below which people will take the steps required, we won't change behavior. This isn't unique to our world. It's pretty much across the board. One of our esteemed regional administrators, we tried to price him out of the cost of smoking. Fortunately, a little scare got him to quit. But it took a fairly significant event to change behavior. We cannot wait for significant events like that occur to change the behavior in this country. We have to start focusing on what is the cost of mitigating risk and view it from the lens not as a transaction that occurs at the point of construction and sale, but what is that total cost of ownership to the taxpayer? Is that an appropriate risk? And in some cases, it does make sense. We have too much built infrastructure to walk away from that and say we're not going to provide for that. But where we can make the greatest impact is going forward. Are we building for the risk that we have in our communities in a way that builds resiliency, protects the taxpayer, encourage more private investment in managing that risk? And again, as we find, whether it's earthquakes, climate change, there's a lot of things we know we don't know yet. We always have to keep looking to the future. We can never just say we're done. It is a constant evolution as earthquakes occur, as new risks are identified, the intertwinement. Mark kind of talked about this, but we saw with the earthquake in Japan that we had primary impacts of the earthquake and tsunami. We had secondary impacts of the isolation and devastation because the transportation system was destroyed along the coast. And then the tertiary effects of catastrophic failures of a nuclear power plant, all occurring from one single event. I mean, that's the other part of the response side, is even if you live in a place like Florida, which is not at significant risk of earthquakes, major earthquakes can affect our economy. When you look at how vertically integrated some of our sectors have become, how much comes through this port at Long Beach? Disruptions here will impact states far from the area of impact. So these are national issues. These are not, as much as we talk about all disasters are local, there is a compelling national interest to ensuring that we are working together, because these will not occur as singular events. These large-scale earthquakes have widespread repercussions, impacts, and levels of secondary follow-on that in many cases we only find out about because we start doing the type of planning that needs to be done. As Mark says, our silos of excellence don't prepare us for earthquake risk. We're working with our 3 states on the West Coast for the Cascadian subduction zone and earthquake tsunami risk. And in doing that, we have identified all kinds of issues, because what most people don't understand, One of the states most seriously impacted by that event may not feel any seismic activity, but they all by themselves will generate emergency response of dire consequence. State of Alaska. Because if CTEC's taken out and we lose the ability to ship commodities to Alaska from the West Coast, they run about a 3 to 4 day supply of most of their consumables. Now think about that. We're all focused on where the earthquake tsunami happens, yet one of our large logistical challenges will be a state that wasn't even impacted directly by the seismic activity, but because we severed their lifelines, would all by itself generate a response of a magnitude we haven't done in a long time. But until you start planning for what can happen, as Mark says, the silos of excellence keep you from seeing the total picture. So the last thing that we'll talk about in our exercises and what we are planning for, and I'm pretty sure for those at the local and state level you've run into this, is the tendency that we plan for what we're capable of doing, not what can happen. I think one of our biggest challenges is we started taking the data from USGS and from NOAA and everybody else and talking about Cascadia. It was pretty much still in the realm of the science community, the researchers, and some reporters that were writing about this risk. But if you actually went to the local level and says, what are you planning for this? It was as Mark would say. They were planning for their community. It was basically, I plan for my community. I'm going to get resources from the outside. We're going to respond. We're going to, our plan is very simple: life-saving, life-sustaining, get the infrastructure back up. And so when we started presenting this, and we used and this is, I think, one of these partnerships with USGS that cannot be understated. In too many cases, people said, well, that's kind of far-fetched. No, the data's there. We ran the models. And we started sitting down with people and going, this isn't like somebody in a room writing a Tom Clancy novel of what could go wrong. This is taking base data that we have, running our predictive models, which in some cases we know still underestimate or overestimate, but it gives us a ballpark range. And we said, this is the impact. The first response from a lot of our local communities was, that's too hard. We're not going to do it. Excuse me? Well, that's not going to happen. Why? Well, it's just too big. Okay, you do understand you're in the disaster business. But it's interesting that even in our own profession, we have mental blocks that say we plan for what we are comfortable with, what we understand, what we're capable of doing. We don't plan for what can happen. And as we began, and I think this was what helped us, we weren't just speculating. We had good data. And as they got the briefings and they sat down with USGS and they sat down with NOAA and talked about the tsunami risk and talked about the likelihood and the history of this fault and the potential energy in this fault, slowly the conversation started to change from this will never happen to it's too big. We're like, so? What do you mean it's too big? We're going to quit and go home? And it's forced us to have these hard conversations that start that process of really looking at how we would respond to what could happen, not what we were prepared to do. And in many cases, that starts changing what we were prepared to do and the what may be required. If nothing else, I've learned the hard way is we do not scale up well as organizations. You either go big or go home. Applies to disasters as much as anything else. You have to plan for what the risk is and what the potential impacts are, not what you can afford. And having come out of too many situations where on the 10-year anniversary of Katrina, people wanted to go, well, what went wrong? Who was to blame? And there were always, people that they want to single out and go, that was the reason we failed. That's not why we failed. At the local and state and federal level, everybody knew that New Orleans had a risk. We had the National Hurricane Conference there that spring before Katrina hit. We talked about the risk. But the reality was we'd been through numerous storms before, and we prepared and responded to what we had been through, not what could happen. And if you looked at that response, and you take it away from the personalities, and you looked at what had they done previously in similar threats, they did almost exactly what they had done. In fact, they actually did better. The problem was they were planning for what they were capable of doing, what they were willing to do, not what could happen, even though they had the information. There was no mystery about what could happen in New Orleans. But the planning had always been, it's never that bad, the storms always turn, it's so difficult to evacuate. Just the idea of evacuating a hospital is mind-boggling. We know we're going to have significant risks there. And so the real factor I think that happened was, even though they knew it could happen, their plan was, we just hope it's never that bad. And they failed. And we failed at all levels. And so we know from other hazards, we know from earthquakes, and particularly for earthquakes that are such a, fortunately, infrequent of it, even though California has a lot of it, it is infrequent enough that it's easy to fall into the trap that I'll prepare for what our history tells us to prepare for, and we just hope it's never that bad. And if it is, we hope our systems will scale up. History tells us, at least for FEMA, that strategy will fail, which means we fail our citizens. So the simple talking points I could have started off with and been done about a half hour ago is this. We price risk below the point at which we change behavior in this country, and the argument that affordability should be at the point of transaction is a false economy. Affordability means total cost of home ownership, total cost of ownership of infrastructure. A big piece of that is it insurable? Because it isn't, we're transferring risk somewhere else, or we're leaving people extremely vulnerable that when the disaster happens, they lose everything. The second point is we need to continue to evolve and understand that our knowledge of the risk are always growing and changing. Therefore, we can never stop looking at the risk, looking at how to mitigate and minimize those risks, and incorporate that. Building codes cannot be static. Land use management cannot be static. These are dynamic processes that must constantly evolve as our knowledge of the risk evolves. And the third point is, in preparing and responding to earthquakes, we do not have the luxury of only preparing for what we think will happen or what we're prepared to respond to. We need to base it upon the science and the data that tells us about risk and translate that into the impacts and response. And this is a national issue because, again, large-scale earthquakes will not be a silo of one community. It will be hundreds of communities impacting states, regions, national economy, worldwide economies. And that the impacts of major earthquakes will not be isolated to the geographical region that felt the shaking. Supply chain management could see all kinds of disruptions far beyond that point, which will again consume, as a nation, resources and time to deal with that, not only just the area of impact. This is for us at FEMA, when we look at risk, one of the biggest ones that we deal with. Unlike many others, it does not provide seasonal forecast, days to week forecast. And if we're lucky and Mark's team can work with the science to pull this off and we can figure out how to do it, we may be able to now deal with the life threats and some of the major impacts of an initial earthquake if we can build a detection system tied to a warning system, tied to action. Because if we can get people to do something as simple as drop, cover, and hold on, we can reduce injuries. If we can go one step further and get to where we can automatically shut down systems to protect them and keep it from getting any worse, we may start with a recovery with intact systems versus destroyed systems. But we'll only have minutes. Unlike a hurricane, we can see coming. Earthquakes don't give us that. So, as I like to remind people at FEMA, who usually think June 1st is when we get ready for disaster, there is no season for earthquakes. There may be a hurricane season, but there is no season for earthquakes. Thank you very much.